I always thought love sounded like the rustle of wheat stalks under the wind, calm, continuous, and life-giving. I, Jennifer, was a 20-year-old girl whose entire world was confined within the borders of a small village. A village where the scent of rain-soaked earth and the smell of alcohol and antiseptic from the clinic created all my olfactory memories. Being the injection nurse at the small village clinic was not an easy job, but I loved it because I knew that when my shift was over, there was someone waiting for me outside those white walls for whom my heart beat. Jack. Jack was a simple laborer who worked on other people's farmlands, but to me, he was the king of all those golden plains. Our souls had been tied together for months, and our decision to marry was the most definite decision of our lives. When I looked into his eyes, I saw a future where poverty didn't matter. Only us mattered. But in this quiet village, not everything was as safe as it seemed. Every day, around noon, I would hear the sound of a bicycle bell that made my heart churn. It was the sound of Lucas's bicycle, the village postman. Lucas was the same age as us, a boy with a gaze that lingered too long and a smile that never reached his eyes. He delivered people's letters and packages, but when he came to the clinic, his excuse was always something else. That day, he came as usual. The sound of his bicycle brakes squeaked behind the injection room window. I held my breath and busied myself arranging the syringes. The door opened, and Lucas's shadow fell on the white floor tiles. "Hello, Jennifer. There's no letter for the clinic today, but there is a message I must deliver only to you." Without looking up, I said, "Hello, Lucas. I think we've already had this conversation. I don't have time." Lucas stepped closer. His voice had a slight tremor, a mix of pleading and persistence. "Jennifer, how long are you going to fool yourself? Jack has nothing. He doesn't even own an inch of land. I have a government job, a steady salary. I love you madly. Just say yes, and I promise you'll be the happiest woman in this village." I lifted my head and looked straight into his eyes. I had to be firm. "Lucas, happiness for me means being with the person my heart has chosen. Jack and I are going to get married. Please, please don't talk about this anymore and let us remain colleagues." Lucas's face turned red. A vein bulged in his neck, and for a moment, I saw a frightening spark in his eyes. But he quickly composed himself and gave a bitter smirk. "Marriage, fine, but remember, Jennifer, love doesn't put food on the table. My patience is long, very long." He left, and I was left with my fast-beating heart. This wasn't the first time he had proposed, nor the first time he was rejected, but his persistence smelled of danger. That evening, when my work was done, I saw Jack waiting for me beside the wooden fences of the farm. His work clothes were dusty, and his forehead was sweaty, but his smile took away all the tiredness of the day. He took my hand. His hands were rough and calloused, but they were the warmest sanctuary in the world. Jack said excitedly, "Jennifer, I spoke to the landowner today. If this year's harvest is good, I can rent a small room at the end of the village. It won't be long until we belong to each other." I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell him Lucas had come again. I wanted to say I was afraid of the postman's gaze. But when I saw the spark of hope in Jack's eyes, my tongue failed me. Jack was proud and protective. If he knew Lucas was constantly harassing me, rage would blind him. There would be a fight. Maybe he would lose his job. Maybe he would get into trouble. I smiled, but I was in turmoil. I squeezed his hand tighter and said, "I can't wait, Jack. No one can separate us." At that moment in that orange sunset, I didn't know how cruel fate was and how frightening the word no one could be. I stayed silent to protect my love, unaware that silence sometimes becomes one's biggest enemy. Days passed, sweet and slow like honey. Jack and I lived in our little bubble of happiness, oblivious to the storm brewing outside that was about to destroy everything. It was exactly 3 days after that frightening conversation with Lucas. I was disinfecting the tables in the clinic when the door burst open. It was Jack, but not the usual Jack with a wide smile. His face was white as plaster, and he was gasping for breath. My heart dropped. I asked, flustered, "Jack, what is it? Has something happened?" Jack slumped onto the waiting chair and buried his head in his hands. His voice trembled, a tremor that reached my bones. My mother had an accident in New York, Jennifer. The world spun around me. I knew his mother was the only family Jack had in the world, a woman who had worked alone in the bustle of New York for years to send money to her son. Jack continued, "My uncle just called. He says her condition is critical. Her legs and back are broken. There is no one to even give her a glass of water. My uncle is old. He can't constantly look after her. I have to go, Jennifer. I have to go." The word go hammered in my head like a sledgehammer. New York, for us villagers, wasn't just a name on a map. It was a black hole. Whoever went there never came back. Tears welled up in my eyes. I walked over and held his frozen hands. "When will you come back?" Jack looked at me. A heavy sadness swelled in his eyes. "I don't know. Until she gets better. Maybe a few months." A few months. A few months of separation for a love that couldn't bear one day of not hearing from each other felt like a life sentence. But there was no choice. He was her son, and his mother needed him. On the day he left, the village sky was gray, as if the clouds knew what was about to happen. The old bus stop was deserted. Jack had his small canvas bag slung over his shoulder. Before getting on, he embraced me. I inhaled the scent of his body with all my might to save it for the months of longing. Jack whispered in my ear, "Don't cry, Jennifer. I promise I'll be back soon. I'll write to you every day. I'll think of you every moment." I lifted my head from his chest and asked anxiously, "The address? Do you have the address? Where should I write to?" Jack sighed and said, "That's the worst part of it. My mother moved houses a few days ago. She went to a new rented place. I don't have that address. I have to go to my uncle's house first. He has the new address. As soon as I arrive and settle down, I'll send you the exact address in the first letter so you can write to me too." The bus driver honked, a sound like a death knell. Jack kissed my forehead, a kiss whose warmth stayed on my skin for years. "Wait for me, Jennifer. Don't let anyone take my place." "I'll wait, Jack, forever." He got on. The bus rattled down the dirt road, and its dust swallowed the figure of the man who was my entire world. At that moment, I didn't know I was seeing the last clear image of him. I didn't know how that cursed address that Jack didn't have was about to become a toy in the hands of a jealous postman. I stood there until the bus was just a black dot on the horizon. And just as I turned back toward the clinic, I saw Lucas's shadow watching us from afar on his bicycle. There was no smile on his face, but his look was like that of a hunter whose prey has finally been left alone. The first few days after Jack left, the village turned into a large, empty cage for me. Everywhere I looked, a memory of him hung in the air like dust. The wheat field was just dry grass without him, and the sky was no longer the usual blue. I knew New York was a crowded, cruel city. I was constantly worried. Had Jack arrived safely? Had his mother survived? Had he found a place to sleep? My only comfort was the promise he had made. I will write as soon as I arrive and send the new address. I waited, like a thirsty person in the desert, waiting for a drop of rain. 6 days passed. 6 days where every hour felt like a lifetime. Every noon, I strained my ears for the familiar sound of Lucas's bicycle. And finally, on the noon of the 6th day, the dry, metallic sound of the bicycle brake was heard outside the clinic door. My heart pounded so hard in my chest, I thought it would jump out. I dropped my work and rushed to the door. Lucas stood outside. The large leather postman's bag weighed heavily on his shoulder. Seeing me appear breathless at the door, he gave a crooked smile, a smile devoid of any warmth. With a voice I tried to keep from trembling, I asked, "Hello, Lucas. Any news? A letter for me?" Lucas, with agonizing nonchalance, reached into his bag. The rustling of papers sounded like the music of life and death to me. He shuffled through a few envelopes. The seconds felt like years. Suddenly, his hands stopped. He looked at me and shrugged his shoulders. "No, Jennifer, I'm sorry. Nothing today either." I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. "Are you sure? Did you look carefully? Only 6 days have passed, but he promised to write immediately. Maybe it's stuck among the other letters." Lucas closed the bag and, in a tone smelling of manufactured pity, said, "I checked everything. Maybe he's busy. You know, New York changes people. New distractions, new people." His words were like a snake's bite. I immediately retorted, "Jack is not like that. Something must have happened. Maybe he hasn't settled yet." Lucas nodded and got back on his bicycle. "Think whatever you like, but if I were him, I wouldn't keep the person I loved waiting even for 6 hours, let alone 6 days. He rode off, and I stared despairingly at the empty spot where he had been. That day, I didn't know that in that same brown leather bag, right under Lucas's hands, was an envelope that smelled of Jack's hands, a love letter that Jack had written with all his heart, and, most importantly, contained the new house address. Jack had written in his letter, "My dearest Jennifer, being away from you is the hardest thing in the world. I'm writing Mother's new address for you, so you can write to me. I anxiously await your words to survive in this foreign city." But I didn't read those words. That night, in the privacy of his room, Lucas opened the letter, read it, and instead of delivering it to me, hid it in his old wooden chest. A chest that was destined to be the graveyard of our love. Days passed. Jack, across the line of cut-off calls and thousands of miles of distance, waited for my reply. He thought the letter had reached me, and I wasn't answering. And I, across the distance, thought he had forgotten me, and hadn't even written a line. Because the first letter hadn't arrived, I had no address to write to him. "Jack, I'm still waiting." And because Jack received no reply, he grew more despairing every day. The silence between us deepened and became more terrifying with every letter Lucas stole. And this was just the beginning of the postman's wicked plan. 2 months passed, 60 days where every second felt like a knife scraping against my skin. During this time, Jack's mother was discharged from the hospital and returned to their rented home. But Jack, he hadn't stayed silent. I later learned that he had picked up the pen not once, not twice, but dozens of times. Jack had written to me every week, sometimes every few days, with hope and longing. Dozens of envelopes in which he pleaded for news of me, repeated his mother's new address countless times, and asked why I was silent. But Lucas's hands, like an invisible and merciless wall, stood between us. He stole all those letters, one after another, and added them to his collection of betrayals in that cursed chest. That chest was now full of Jack's unanswered cries. Jack, on the other side of the world, broke more with every unanswered letter. He thought I had been unfaithful, and I sank further into the well of despair every day. I thought Jack, the simple village boy, had forgotten his love now that he had tasted New York life, and didn't even bother to write a single line. But Lucas was not satisfied with this silence. He saw that Jack was not giving up and kept sending letters. He was afraid one day one of these letters would slip past him and reach me. So he decided to end it once and for all. He wanted to kill the hope in both our hearts so he could take Jack's place. One autumn day, when the leaves of the clinic trees had turned yellow and orange, Lucas came. This time, however, he didn't have his usual crooked, mocking smile. He wore a somber and sad expression. He was playing the part of a skilled actor bearing bad news. He stood in front of my desk. He placed an envelope on the desk. An envelope that had neither a stamp nor a postmark. Only my name was written on it. With a trembling voice, I asked, "What is this, Lucas?" Lucas lowered his head and said softly, "A letter from Jack. But honestly, I didn't want to be the one to give this to you." I reached out and picked up the envelope. My hands were shaking. I pulled out the paper. The handwriting resembled Jack's, but it seemed hastily and carelessly written. Lucas had practiced forging Jack's handwriting for months. I started reading, and with every word, a piece of my being crumbled. "Jennifer, writing this letter is hard for me. Life in New York has changed many things. I realize that our worlds are different. I met a girl here whose situation is more compatible with mine, and we got married. Please don't wait for me anymore and forget me. It's better for both of us. Goodbye forever, Jack." The letter fell from my hand and dropped to the floor. It felt as if all the blood in my body had dried up. I couldn't breathe. Married? Just like that? All those promises, all those I love yous under the village sky, were all lies? Lucas came closer. He poured me a glass of water and pretended to be sympathetic. "Jennifer, are you all right? I knew he wasn't worthy of you. I had heard he met someone there, but I didn't believe it until he gave me this letter to post." I wasn't crying. The pain was so great that the tears had dried up. I was just staring at a point in space. At the same time, miles away, in New York, Jack was opening a letter that Lucas had forged from me. In that letter, written in a handwriting that resembled mine, it said, "Jack, the separation was too hard, and I couldn't bear it. I got married. Please don't write to me anymore and let me have a quiet life. Forget me." Lucas, with 2 forged pieces of paper, while his chest was full of Jack's real loving letters, buried 2 loving hearts alive. In the clinic, broken and devastated, I looked at Lucas and whispered, "It's over, Lucas. Everything is over." And Lucas, trying to hide the spark of triumph in his eyes, put his hand on my shoulder. "I'm here, Jennifer. I'm always here. Don't let his grief wear you down." That night, for the first time, I wished I had never fallen in love. I didn't know that this was not the end of the story. but the beginning of 30 years of silence, pain, and separation. The village was no longer home. It was a torture chamber. Every corner was the shadow of Jack, who had turned his back on me. I had to leave. I had to go somewhere no one had ever heard his name. We decided to leave like shadows, quietly, without saying goodbye. I didn't want Lucas's heavy gaze following me. Our destination was California. We left at night and entered a sunny foreign land. In California, we started a new life. My father got a job in a large factory, and I worked in a busy clinic. We hadn't completely unpacked our suitcases yet, and I thought I was finally free from Lucas. But fate, or rather Lucas, showed that his pursuit knew no geographical boundaries. Just 2 days after I started my job at the clinic, it happened. It was evening. As I was leaving the clinic, I saw Lucas leaning against a strange car, with that same crooked smile. Terror seized my entire being. What are you doing here? How did you find us? Lucas said with a terrifying pride. I followed you, Jennifer, shadowing you. I told you I wouldn't leave you alone. And then he started insisting. Lucas stayed in California and pressured me for several consecutive days. He appeared outside my workplace every day, sent flowers, pleaded, and relentlessly pressured me to marry him with insane persistence. But after those few tense days, Lucas suddenly disappeared. 1 day, 2 days, there was no news of Lucas. I was surprised. Where had the persistent village postman who wouldn't leave me alone for a moment gone now? I thought he had finally given up and gone back. This sudden disappearance was strange and at the same time comforting. A few days later, as I was walking home from work, I saw an old, tired man with a familiar stature standing outside our house. It was Lucas's father. How had he found us in the unfamiliarity of California with his old, tearful eyes? I went forward in surprise. Sir, what are you doing here? Lucas's father gave me a sad look. His eyes were full of tears. My son gave me this address before this happened. My breath caught in my chest. What? What happened? Lucas had an accident, Jennifer, in California. The doctors say his condition is not good, and he's in a coma. I brought him back to the village. He's sleeping, like a piece of dry wood. I was confused and stunned. The man who was the cause of all my misery was now in a coma, but I felt sorry for his elderly father. Lucas's father came closer and held my hands. His hands were trembling. I heard you're a good, pure girl. My son was madly in love with you. I beg you, Jennifer, please pray for him. I know if you truly wish it, God will hear your voice and Lucas will get better. You're the only one who can work a miracle for him. I didn't know whether to pray or not. I didn't know how the resentment should leave my heart. All I knew was that Lucas was no longer harassing me. Lucas's father left, and I was left with the heavy weight of his request. Lucas slept. He slept until 30 years later. 30 years that were stolen from my entire life for the price of one dormant lie. 30 years of hard work in California didn't make us rich. It made us poorer and more exhausted. My father, whose hair was now completely white and whose back was bent under the weight of years of factory work, could no longer work. He was sick, his heart was weak, and we were literally destitute for treatment and to pay off overdue debts. My new clinic didn't pay much either. My life had turned into a repetitive loop. Work, treating my father, worry. It was right at the peak of this financial desperation that the doorbell of our small house on the outskirts of California rang. The sound of the bell was gentle, but its vibration shook our entire house. I opened the door, and my world was thrown back 30 years. Standing behind the door was the same elderly man, Lucas's father. But this time was different. He was no longer the tired farmer. He wore expensive clothes, and his eyes, though old, had the sparkle of wealth. I realized that in these 30 years, Lucas had been in a coma, but their lands and property had grown, and they had become wealthy. I asked in surprise, "Sir, you, after all these years?" Lucas's father gave a bitter smile. "Hello, Jennifer. I know you're surprised. I came to bring you the news of his recovery. My son woke up." My breath hitched. Lucas was awake? That 3-decade lie was now coming out of its grave. Lucas's father said, "Just as I asked you 30 years ago, God heard your prayer. My son woke up, but he's not well. His body is weak, and he still can't speak properly. He keeps repeating only one thing, Jennifer." He stepped closer and presented the main issue with a serious yet kind demeanor. "I came to ask you for a request, not a plea, a business request." Lucas's father pulled a thick envelope from his jacket pocket. "Lucas insists that his only nurse and caregiver be you. I trust your skills at the clinic, and I need you. I'm willing to pay you a salary you can't refuse. $10,000 a month, Jennifer, plus the payment of all your father's debts and a small house in the village." My eyes widened. $10,000, an amount I wouldn't have accumulated in my 30 years of work in California. This offer could save my father from work and death. It could free us from poverty. There was a storm in my heart. Should I return to that village? To a place where the smell of wheat and the memory of Jack made breathing difficult? And worse, should I nurse the man who had destroyed my entire life? I said in a choked voice. I need to think." Lucas's father interrupted me. He seemed to know what position I was in. "Look, Jennifer, I know you are a pure girl. 30 years ago, your prayer saved my son. Lucas only needs you for his full recovery. Please, come for 1 month. If you're not comfortable, you can go back. But this money can save your father's life." I thought of my father's sick face, of the bills piled up, of the future that grew darker every day. There was no choice. I was defeated. My dead love for Jack had kept me in poverty, and now the most treacherous man in the world was bribing me to return. Tears welled up in my eyes. "I accept. I will go back." Lucas's father smiled. His smile smelled like a devil's bargain to me. He immediately arranged the return ticket to the village for me. Now, after 30 years, Jennifer, the old and tired nurse, had to return to the house where her eternal love was supposed to be built. But this time, to care for the silent devil who had ruined that love. My father and I returned to our village using Lucas's father's money. He hadn't paid the debts yet, but he had paid for the trip and the start of my work. This return was the bitterest journey of my life. 30 years ago, I had fled in despair. And now I returned in complete desperation. I began nursing Lucas. He was overcome with happiness to see me, as if his 30-year sleep had finally paid off. He was paralyzed from the neck down and had to remain in bed forever, but my presence was enough for him. Now wealthy and the owner of a luxurious home, he used his father's influence to eventually persuade me. Months passed. Lucas made every effort during that time to persuade me to marry him, but my heart was still left in New York, beside Jack, whom I thought had married. I rejected his proposals with the same coldness as 30 years ago. But fate struck again from where I least expected it. My father. My father's old debts, forgotten in the hustle of our return, reached a crisis point. He was imprisoned. At that moment, the world went dark for me. My father, the only person I had to endure prison in his condition of illness and old age? The horror and desperation brought me to my knees. Lucas, who was always attentive to my weaknesses, took advantage of the situation. One day, with a kind yet threatening smile, he told me, "Jennifer, I know how much you love your father. I can pay off all his debts today and free him, with just one condition." His condition was clear: marriage to Lucas. With tearful eyes, I looked at Lucas. "You are a devil in human form." But I had no choice. My father was more important than anything else. I sold my destiny for the price of my father's debts. But Lucas, to ensure his eternal victory, added another condition. Before the marriage contract, he took a check from me for the amount of my father's debt, so that if I tried to leave him and go after Jack after my father's release, he would cash the check and send me to prison. Lucas held me captive financially. Out of necessity, I married Lucas, and we continued our life together in Lucas's father's house. Immediately after the marriage, Lucas, through his father, paid off all my father's debts and freed him from prison. My heart was happy for my father, but my soul was imprisoned in a golden cage. Sometime later, more shocking news came. I became pregnant with Lucas's child. Lucas was ecstatic. He now possessed both me and a child from me. Life was complete for him, but for me, it was a deep, dark nightmare that grew darker every day. During those days, Lucas and his father had gone to New York for medical treatment procedures. I remained alone in the village, while under my heart, a fetus from this bitter marriage was growing. But fate had not yet finished with us and had not started the final game. I was alone in Lucas's father's luxurious house. Lucas and his father had gone to New York for further treatment procedures. Under my heart, a fetus from this bitter marriage was growing. A child that was meant to tie me to Lucas forever. Right at the peak of my loneliness and silence, the ground shook. A huge and terrible earthquake collapsed the village. Lucas's father's large, sturdy house crumbled like a paper postcard. I couldn't escape and was trapped under a mound of rubble and broken beams. In that darkness and terror, under the rubble and amidst the pain, I suddenly heard the sound of wood crushing near my ear. The debris of the house had fallen directly onto Lucas's chest and broken it. The letters, all the old, yellow, and dusty letters, had spilled out of the broken chest. In the faint light shining through a crack in the rubble, with my bloody and trembling hands, I picked up a few of them. They were Jack's letters. Letters that had never reached me 30 years ago. Reading them under the rubble, amidst the terror and pain, was the bitterest experience of my life. Seeing the pile of these letters, the whole truth became clear to me. These letters proved that Jack had never forgotten me. Lucas had been stealing his letters all these years and had left me with a big lie. At that moment, the roof collapsed over my head. But this collapse was not as heavy as the collapse of the lie Lucas had brought down on our lives. My whole being was consumed by rage and madness. The rescue workers arrived in time and pulled me out from under the rubble and transferred me to the hospital. But the severity of the injuries and the nervous tension of those moments led to a miscarriage. In one night, I both found my love, which had been dead for 30 years, alive, and lost the child that was not yet born. After 2 weeks of hospitalization and discharge, I never agreed to return to Lucas's father's house and went to my own small house. Lucas and his father were surprised by my refusal to return. They came to my father's house to visit and inquire. Lucas, who was forcibly seated in a wheelchair, asked in a weak voice, "Jennifer, why didn't you come back?" I threw Jack's letters in front of Lucas. "Your filthy chest broke, Lucas. I know the whole truth. You stole 30 years of my life and Jack's, and now you've taken the life of my child." Lucas showed no remorse. I announced my final decision. "I'm divorcing you. I will find Jack no matter what and marry him." Lucas smiled and pulled the deposit check out of his clothes pocket. "If you want a divorce and go after Jack, I will cash this check. You will be a prisoner in debt, and your old father will be alone." My father, who was now older and needed care, was my only weakness. To prevent my father from being alone, I was forced, despite knowing the whole truth, to continue my life with Lucas in his father's rebuilt house. A year passed. I lived for a year in Lucas's rebuilt house, with the bitter taste of hatred and threat. I was his wife, but only his nurse and prisoner. My life was tied to Lucas for the sake of my father's freedom. Finally, fate cut the last knot of this bind. A year later, Lucas was in his father's car when they had an accident. This time, the accident was fatal. Lucas suffered a severe head injury, and doctors confirmed his death. He was dead, and I felt a strange mix of freedom and guilt. His family decided to donate his organs. Lucas's father, who was also injured in the accident and bedridden at home, called me one day. With tearful eyes, he held my hands. "Jennifer, I know you hated my son, but he was my son. I have one last request for you. Bring me the person who received Lucas's heart. I want to hear my son's heartbeat one last time." This request was my path to salvation. Through the hospital where Lucas had died, I found the address of the recipient of the heart. The address I saw drove me mad. New York. I immediately went to New York. I went to Jack's house. I knocked on the door. The door opened. Standing behind the door was Jack, a man in his 50s, with gray hair and a lean stature, but with the same warm gaze that had looked at me under the wheat-field sun 30 years ago. At that moment, my heart started pounding in my chest. Jack, after 30 years of separation and torment, was right in front of me. Jack whispered, "Jennifer, is that you?" I cried. I could only nod. At that moment, all the past, all the pain, all the stolen letters became meaningless. We were both stunned to see each other. I convinced Jack to return to the village with me. He accepted. When Jack stood beside Lucas's father's bed, Lucas's father held my hands. I whispered in Lucas's father's ear, "He is the person who received Lucas's heart." Lucas's father placed his head on Jack's chest. He closed his eyes and fulfilled his last wish with complete satisfaction, hearing the heartbeat of his son, a pulse that I had known in Jack's chest 30 years ago. At that moment, I told Jack the whole truth. He realized how much his heart condition was tied to this strange fate, and that I had never left him. He understood that Lucas, even in death, had made sure his heart stayed near me. With the blessing and prayers of Lucas's father, Jack and I, now free from all the sorrows of the past, married each other. After more than 30 years, we found each other. Lucas's heart, which had once caused our separation, was now beating in Jack's chest to begin a new and eternal life for us. Please give me motivation to write new stories by liking the video and subscribing to my channel.